Hi, this is Big Mark, and today is New Year's Eve, Monday, December 31st, 2018. It's early morning here in South Carolina, and I'm recording this in a kind of an internet cafe type of place. There's background noise, you can hear music, you can hear traffic if you listen carefully enough. Okay, and this first image here is a place in South Africa. Every one of those crosses represents someone who has been murdered in a farm attack. And a lot of these murders are very brutal. There's torture. Some of these people had to watch their family members get tortured, raped very brutally before they themselves then got killed very brutally in some cases. Every one of those crosses represents somebody who has been killed, a family that has been disrupted, a farm that had its economic activity impacted, it maybe got out of business. Also, it represents some people who perhaps lost their jobs because of the farm attack. And these are families that are impacted, such as the woman shown here with her children. She's now a widow. Katie Hopkins and Lauren Southern have both done most excellent documentaries on the farm attack phenomenon and its impact. I would refer you to their material, which you can get on YouTube, Katie Hopkins and Lauren Southern. For my part, I'm looking at a different perspective on this. And for what we're looking at, we have to go to this place. It is a building in Moscow, and the picture was taken during the days of the former Soviet Union. From here, where the picture was taken, and at the time the picture was taken, off to the left there was a store called Детский Мир. It had everything that you would need for kids from when they were born right on up until they were graduating school. There's a road that takes you to the left, and it goes down to a square, and on the other side of that square, less than a kilometer away, is the Bolshoi Theater. And from where this picture is taken, to your right and behind you, there's another tiny little road, little street that takes you to Revolution Square, and then GUM, which was the main department store in the Soviet Union, and then of course Red Square and the Kremlin. The Kremlin is about a click away from this location. In the picture, you see a building. It has gone through some modifications, some upgrades. Originally, the building itself was constructed in the 1890s to house a Russian insurance agency called the Rossiya during the Tsarist era. After the revolution, which wasn't really a revolution, the Great October Revolution that put the communists in power was more of a coup d'etat, but that's another story. After the communists took power in Russia, there was a man that Lenin's picture is right there on the front of the building. He tasked to build the secret police that Lenin needed in order to keep the people of his new empire, and that's what it was, under control. That man was named Felix Dzerzhinsky. You can see his statue on the right. In modern times, this location is called the Lubyanka Square, but back in the days of the Soviet Union, it had been named Dzerzhinsky Square in honor of the man who founded the secret police and whose statue you see right there. What Dzerzhinsky founded was something called the CK after its Russian initials, and you can see in the screenshot here an image from the Russian Wikipedia which talks about it. The CK was established in 1917 in the wake of the revolution as the secret police that Lenin was going to use to basically eliminate any type of dissent in the newly conquered territories of the former Russian Empire. throughout the Soviet era, because of the foundation as the Cheka, secret police members were known as Chekists. For example, the current president of the Russian Federation, President Putin, came up through the Soviet secret police. He's a Chekist. The secret police should not be confused with Soviet military intelligence. This image here talks a little bit about them. The GRU, as it is known, is Soviet military intelligence. Its job, theoretically and quite simply, was to prevent the downfall of the Soviet Union from outside of the Soviet Union. In contrast to that, the KGB, which evolved from the Cheka, had the job of preventing the downfall of the Soviet Union from within, put in its most simple terms and theoretically. The Cheka went through various evolutions, various name changes. It was known as the NKVD during World War II. And ultimately, in the post-Stalin era, they settled on the name KGB, which in Russian was Committee for State Security. And its headquarters was in that building, Lubyanka. And that's a fairly central location in Moscow. As we discussed previously, it's only about a kilometer from the Kremlin itself. What a lot of people don't realize about the KGB, there's a lot of things people don't realize, was its size, both in numbers of people and amount of equipment and budget, but also in scope of activities. We say in Russian, «Даже где нет секретов, это секрет». Even where there are no secrets, that is a secret. And you can see that illustrated in this image, which came from a newspaper back during the Cold War. They are showing a 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 7th, and 9th directorates. There's an 8th directorate down on the next line. What about the 4th directorate, the 5th directorate? Didn't these exist? Well, of course they did. But the KGB was so secret that you might hear of an 8th directorate, and that was how you had to realize that there was a 7th and a 6th and a 5th. Of course, the fact that they called it the 8th directorate might also be disinformation designed to mislead you. The KGB was very good at that as well. Be that as it may, you can see that they're talking about it employed anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million people. Of course, people, again, they don't understand the immense size of the KGB. So in the West, we have, in the United States, for example, we've got the CIA, which performs foreign intelligence activities. We've got the FBI, which performs counterintelligence on American soil. And we've got other agencies. You go over to the United Kingdom, they've got MI5, which is kind of like the FBI. You've got MI6, which is kind of like the CIA. And then you go to Italy, you go to France, you go to Norway. They've all got some type of a comparable intelligence service. Okay, take all of those, put them together. The KGB was bigger. The KGB had responsibilities which included, for example, protection of VIPs. The KGB was in charge of protecting nuclear warheads when they were in storage, suppression of dissent within the Soviet Union, but also they were involved in a tremendous amount of activities abroad, and that's what we'll be focusing on here. As I mentioned, there's a lot of secrets surrounding the KGB. When the Soviet Union fell, we started to get a lot more information about the KGB and their operations. Now, we had always had some stuff that was leaking to the media. We always had some defectors. But after the Soviet Union fell, a lot of people came over, and some of these people came over with files. And a lot of that made it into the mainstream media. And even people who had been following the Soviet Union were somewhat shocked at the extent of the KGB's infiltration of the West. Important people, famous people, as well as people that you probably never heard of unless you happen to be related to them. A lot of people had contact with the KGB, and many of these people never knew it. Many of them were aware of it and tried to avoid the KGB. Some people foolishly thought that they could interact with these guys and come out unscathed. And of course, there were the occasional sellouts. In the wake of that, there was discussion in Congress about the KGB's role here in the North American region. A lot of folks don't quite understand the extent to which the KGB helped set up Fidel Castro. They subverted Cuba. They were always on the watch for a place where they could stir up trouble, and for trouble that was getting stirred up that they could maneuver, steer, take over. And so they weren't satisfied to just finish by having a communist regime, a very oppressive one, established in Cuba, but they had to use that as a base for further operations. And you can see here in the Senate, there was discussion about the KGB's connection to drug trafficking. And it's funny because when you look through a lot of the American, perhaps I should use the term alternative media, you will hear discussion about the role of U.S. government in drug trafficking. And of course, to think that it's official policy of the U.S. government to traffic narcotics into the United States is ridiculous. However, to believe that there are corrupt government officials involved in it, well, there's always been corruption. There's always been corrupt government officials involved in illegal activities. And so it's very accurate to think that there were people who should have been stopping the flow of drugs who instead were making money by turning a blind eye to that or even facilitating it. But what's interesting is while people will blame the U.S. government, nobody goes back and blames foreign government, in particular the Soviet government and the KGB. It was official policy of them, although it was secret official policy, to facilitate trafficking of narcotics into the United States. Why? Well, the drugs themselves come in and destroy American society from within. Drug abuse, drug addiction, it's terrible. It brings crime with it as people are committing street crime to try to get money to buy their drugs. It brings crime as different drug trafficking organizations are murdering each other for control of turf, for distribution of drugs, and for movement of drugs. And there's a lot of money in drug trafficking. A lot of people don't realize that. For example, cocaine, very lucrative. A cocaine trafficking organization could lose half of their product en route to shipping it to the market, and they would still be very, very profitable. So there's quite a bit of money to be made. And in particular, this is good for the KGB because it was money that the Soviet Union did not have to come up with out of their resources, although to be sure, they were always happy to come up with money in Moscow for foreign subversion, even when their own people were starving. But that's irrelevant. The KGB, on their part, could get what we call black money for black ops. The money itself was traceable back to a drug trafficking organization, and if somebody got caught, the KGB could just disappear and leave somebody else holding the bag. So it allowed them to subvert American society with an incredible amount of resources in a very destructive manner, and with little, if anything, that could be traced back to Moscow. Of course, there was a whole lot more going on. For example, the KGB and Soviet military intelligence, the GRU that I mentioned earlier, they did this too. but the KGB had its not just operatives and spies in America, but also what we call sleeper agents, people that would go in and assume an American identity and then go deep underground and wait to be activated. And that activation might take place in an emergency or a crisis or in time of war. They could be activated to do a variety of things, anything from sabotage and potentially sabotage with weapons of mass destruction, up to assisting terrorist attacks, or whatever type of intelligence operation that was ongoing. And these people would assume the identity of somebody who had maybe legitimately been an American, born, and then perhaps passed away in their youth, passed away in their infancy. They would get somebody and recruit them, make sure that they learn very good English, that they learn some American mannerisms, fake some identity papers, and this person who died in his youth, and there's a grave, and you can see the grave of this person that died as a child, but for some weird reason this person is magically living and having a life, and people don't understand it's because it's a KGB sleeper agent. A lot of information about that. It's kind of one of the glamorous sides to the spy story, if you're interested in pursuing that. The KGB was, of course, active all around the world, and during the Cold War era, the Cold War defined the way we looked at the world. We've all heard the use of the term third world, but what does actually that expression mean? Okay, in this particular image, you can see the world divided up into first world, second world, third world. First world was North America, Western Europe, and our allies. So it would have included South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. Second world was the Soviet bloc, Communist China, and North Korea. And the third world was everybody else. Now in this particular graphic, I pulled this down off the internet, and they're showing Greenland as third world. It's kind of a technicality. Greenland, of course, belonged to Western Europe. Regardless, it gives you an idea of what these definitions meant and where the idea of third world came from. In amongst all of the KGB's organization, which again, our understanding of that evolved, they had a lot of activity, a lot of effort devoted towards subverting the third world. For example, I mentioned Cuba. They helped put Castro in power in Cuba, and then used Cuba as a spring point to subvert the rest of Latin America. But also, the Castro regime was active elsewhere in the world. And once again, a lot of that information has leaked out since the Soviet Union collapsed. We've gotten a better look at it, but even still, my personal opinion, I think we're perhaps only seeing the tip of the KGB iceberg and its activities in the third world. Again, in principle, the job of the KGB was to prevent the downfall of the Soviet Union from within. And that meant dealing with dissidents, things of this nature, but that would also mean going overseas and dealing with Russian defectors, with emigres, and taking a look at what activities they were involved in and whether or not that was going to have an impact at home in the Soviet Union. But of course, in practice, the KGB was busy subverting the whole world. People don't realize also the extent of the Soviet Union's aims. When Lenin seized power, they ultimately came to refer to Russia proper as the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. And then the Soviet Union had 15 constituent republics, of which the Russian Republic was one. There was ultimately also a Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic, a Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, After they invaded the Baltic states prior to World War II, there was a Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian Soviet Socialist Republic. The goal was very international. Their job was ultimately, and what they envisioned ultimately, was to establish a Polish Soviet Socialist Republic, a German Soviet Socialist Republic, a French Soviet Socialist Republic. And so in that respect, you need to understand the Communist Party didn't take orders from the Soviet government. It was the other way around. The Soviet government took orders from the Communist Party, and other communist organizations worldwide would have to take orders from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the overseeing organization that was going to spread this great world revolution. That kind of fell apart as there was a break between China and the Soviet Union. There was a break, obviously, with North Korea. But as it was envisioned when Lenin was in charge, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was going to establish communist parties, take over communist parties, and establish Soviet Socialist republics throughout the world. They had envisioned an Australian Soviet Socialist Republic. And with that, I'm going to stop here, and we will pick up in part 2 at some of their activities to push this along.